Okay, everyone, as our next presenter gets ready, just kind of want to touch on a couple questions here. Concerning the curb ramp and the 1 to 15, 1 to 12, I had a question about the 1 to 15, a design standard. Is there a separate construction tolerance? No, these are minimums that are shown, so you need to hit these minimums. So this includes tolerances, everything else just as a true minimum would. Another question coming in, is the 1 to 15 curb ramp slope included in updated city standard details? We'll get to that shortly. The answer is yes, and we'll point that out explicitly. Has it been considered how much, how this will affect the length of the curb ramp? And yes, absolutely. So this has been thought about, discussed internally all throughout the department, and it is, we do understand 1 to 15 will require more room, but is the department, this is the desire as far as requiring a more gradual slope for our residents. With that, we will turn to the next portion of our presentation. So as kind of mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the presentation, we touched on the mention of Chapter 3 and the internal dialogue going on about the department does want to gather asset information as we go through, and plans are submitted to the city through various ways. Chapter 3 is set up for layering discussion, perhaps bringing in assigning attributes to layers and bringing them in this methodology. It's also sparked conversation with Chapter 3, our GIS standards. And so here to speak about the new chapter, Chapter 13 coming out, is Anthony Powell. I'll turn it over to him. Anthony.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anthony Powell, and I am the GIS manager for Houston Public Works. This morning, I'm going to cover the standard requirements when including GIS data deliverables with your projects. Basically, if you were to have any GIS deliverables built into your project, you will be required to follow the standards provided in Chapter 13. Like Brian stated, Chapter 13 is a new chapter, and developing the set of requirements pertaining to GIS deliverables was a major accomplishment. Not only does this improve the process for Houston Public Works to maintain our GIS assets within our asset management system, but it also improves the GIS information that is ultimately made available for you, the community, to leverage. So I will be providing the following high-level summaries for the GIS electronic submittal process, stormwater utility definitions, the wastewater definitions, and the water utility definitions. The diagram that you see here gives you a high-level idea of the various steps of a project life cycle. I won't cover each step, and I'll just jump between steps 4 and 5 at the substantial completion stage. At this point, you would be creating your GIS data layers per the project statement of work, and then you would provide your GIS deliverables to Public Works. At that time, your deliverables would then go through a review process, and after the review has been completed, a notification would be provided to you accordingly. Like I stated earlier, for each GIS asset deliverable, a detailed list of definitions and requirements provided in Chapter 13. You will find detailed descriptions and definitions defining each feature class, each feature type, and the data format requirements. And what you see here is an example of the feature class definitions for the stormwater drainage utilities. So in this section, you would find a list of each data layer, the names. You would see a definition of the type. So for example, there would be a particular data layer for gravity mains, and the feature type defined for that would be a line. Easement would be defined as a polygon. Discharge points would be defined as a point. So there you would find, like I say, all of the various layers and their definition types. Here's an example of what the standard attribute section would look like. So the previous slide showed you the actual fields, names. Here this would give you a description of the attributes that are that should be contained within each feature. So you'd have here kind of shows you the actual field names, the sizes of the fields, the descriptions of those fields, the alias names, and if any fields have any domain requirements. So this section here and will describe each of these attribute standards for each of the storm features. And this slide shows an example of the definition for both the water utilities and the wastewater utilities. So similar to the storm drainage utilities, here you have in the water section, the water utility section, you would find a in-depth description for all the water features, be it their layer names, the attribute definitions and requirements would be all explained and laid out for you there. And same for the wastewater section. So any of the wastewater utilities that may be a part of your project, you could defer to the wastewater section and you would find those field definitions and all of the attribute requirements as well. So that concludes the high-level coverage of the GIS data standards. And at this time, we can answer any questions that you may have.
So just to jump in, I don't see any questions off the bat, Anthony.
Okay.
But just to kind of clarify when, and maybe go over it again, when Chapter 13 does apply, as how do I know to follow Chapter 13?
Yes, so if there's, when you're going through the negotiations with our, with Public Works and you're going through negotiations of your project and identifying all the requirements and whatnot, within that statement of work that's developed, if there are some GIS deliverable requirements specified for that statement of work, then you would defer to Chapter 13 to get an understanding of what those definitions would be. Also within that statement of work, you should have laid out the ability or the instructions for how to deliver those GIS deliverables, how that coordination would take place. All those things would be laid out within that statement of work. So Chapter 13 would be, you would defer to it for at this point, just for those requirements specifically.
And to kind of touch on that a little bit, you know, you should see we work with Cheryl Harris's group and a couple of projects for the standard 3-phase contract to put this as a deliverable, at least early on, when our stormwater folks had a standard. I think the city plans on updating that to kind of have the language to point to Chapter 13 moving forward. So as we develop, I think we'll see that develop.
And we'll continue to monitor questions the remainder of the presentation.
We have a question here.
Go ahead.
How often do you update storm information in GIMS?
I can answer that. I'm Dr. Martin Alcala, Senior Staff Analyst with Transportation and Drainage Operations, and my staff maintains the stormwater infrastructure data. We actually maintain and update data daily. Now, the data on GIMS is not refreshed, but there is an additional kind of widget at the bottom of the GIMS general map site, and I'll take you to a utility map, which Anthony's staff has helped to refresh the data nightly, and that has the stormwater infrastructure, most recent stormwater infrastructure data.
All right, and another question here for Chapter 13. Should these be supplied as shape files or geodatabase?
I can answer that as well. We're going to provide a blank geodatabase that has the schema and data structure with the domain values, and also receive a geodatabase of all the current infrastructure. And so we're expecting a geodatabase that can be delivered.
Okay, with that, kind of to point out and to capitalize on this moment that we have, because we're a little bit ahead of schedule, a few minutes before, this is a trend that you will be seeing. So, with the three-phase contract that's out there now, as the city develops, Chapter 13 gets more in use. What our operations groups had been doing is taking old as-built physical drawings and inputting that and figuring out where their assets are, and actually doing that by hand, sheet by sheet. We are getting away from that completely, trying to run away from that. This will, start with a three-phase contract, but I think the overall plan for the department is to have that with everything that's submitted. Anything that adds to a city asset, no matter what the infrastructure type, the city is moving towards getting that asset information from designers, from the folks that are designing the infrastructure, to have that input into the system. So you'll see more of this develop with Chapter 3 real early on, Chapter 13, stormwater having that standard prior to us doing Chapter 13, TDO and Houston Water working together to put together Chapter 13 this year. You're seeing this conversation evolve, but one thing's for sure, that the city wants to know and needs to know where any new assets are being installed. If there's no other questions, anybody see any other questions, we can move on to a little bit early to Chapter 15.
There is one comment from the city engineer, Ho-Jin Lim. He wanted to note that, he says, please note that GIMS is for general information only. This site is not used for information on design. He just wanted us to point that out.
Yeah, absolutely. So GIMS is for to see generally what's out there, but it is not to be used to be exactly what is in place. It's an indicator that at which point the designer needs to find as-built, go do site work, do whatever, but not rely wholly on GIMS itself. Not in any means.
Mm-hmm.
With that, if the group is okay, we'll move forward to Chapter 15. Okay, so continue to send your questions in, whether it be for Chapter 13 or whatever, anything that we've covered or going to cover today. Like I said, we will try to address them in these question sessions that we have, for question breaks that we have. We'll also have a final question break at the end to address as many questions live as we can, and then again we will be posting an FAQ shortly after, in the near future, after the presentation is given, to address any questions that we have not gotten to. At this time we'll roll into Chapter 15 a couple minutes early, but I think we'll get more questions as we go. So the City of Houston updates the IDM every year. This year Chapter 9 and 13 were reviewed. Excuse me, chapters, as you noticed, Chapters 6, 10, and 12 were reviewed. Chapter 15, again, out of cycle. But there's 3 items that were addressed in Chapter 15. So summary of changes here in front of you, traffic impact analysis, submit for review well before final permitting, submit overall TA if applicable, and updated access management form. So we'll be addressing those in this short presentation. So submit for review well before final permitting. One issue that I think everybody is aware of is that at final permitting, if you're submitting your access form, your TIA at final permitting to start construction, that is way too late. These items will affect your site plan. These discussions that happens through TIAs, the driveway access points will be discussed, the needs will be discussed. So we wanted to stress, we have been doing this with our TIA review process internally at the city to every applicant and stressing that individually as we go through this, but we wanted to also update the IDM to reflect this. Submitting a TIA during, as mentioned, final permitting leads to a lot of issues with all stakeholders. So the TIA needs to be submitted as the plans for are developed to minimize delay and minimize possible significant design changes. So really early on, as you're developing your site plan, you should be having the TIA conversation with the city. We also wanted to enter into Chapter 15. If a TIA is part of a larger plan development, the TIA needs to be included needs to include the overall development. So it's understood that you might be submitting a TIA just for a portion of a development, but we don't want to look at that TIA independentely without having some sense of how that overall TIA is going to affect the community, our assets, or anything else. So it's very difficult to review or discuss or have a conversation about a TIA that's just a portion of what would amount to a much larger TIA for a master plan or master development. So we were asking if a development or redevelopment is a stage of future or larger development, the TIA should include the impact of the overall development, all stages. You'll see there's a couple other places that these items are entered, statements like this. This is what you're seeing is a product of the Houston Public Works Office of the Engineer working with our planning department through the plat review, also through the permitting process and the permitting review, and noticing that these conversations are kind of disjointed. We're trying to align them, but if you're going through a plat, let's have the TIA discussion shortly thereafter, well before you come into permitting. That way, the development can meet the city's needs. There's no issue when we get to final permitting. There's no delay, particularly when we're going through permitting for access management form review or TIA review. We've eliminated all of that. So it's a win-win-win all the way around to get this information to the city and include the city in these discussions early on. Two other items for Chapter 15, we'll discuss the supplement that's been in place for quite some time. About mid-fiscal year, a driveway shall not connect to a substandard street. This will not apply to remove in place of single-family driveways. A shared driveway cannot connect to a street with a width of less than 18 feet. The width of less than 18 feet, that aligns with Chapter 42 and our planning department's policy that is out there as well for a shared driveway. For the substandard street, we're having more and more conversations, as developers know, to align our IDM with the fire code. And so as we go through this and making sure due diligence is held with each, whatever it may be, permit, TIA, or project that we're discussing, we want to make sure that the street is adequate for its intended use. So these discussions are ongoing, and this is part of that discussion. You'll see this in the near future and in IDM revisions to come, this topic growing even more. The final change we made this year to Chapter 15 is the access management form. Previous access management form you see in front of you, kind of outdated. We went through a very long review of this form. We went back and looked at what actually people are submitting, what we actually needed. We also went to other cities to see what other cities were using. This form, this pre-access management form, is used as a pre-TIA form. So really determine the access points for development, but we also look at it to say, okay, do you have enough trips generated by your development to trigger a TIA? Do we need to take a closer look at this? So with that, I kind of want to emphasize at this point, the term Form A, and for everybody listening, and we're trying to desperately to get this term just deleted from everybody's vocabulary. Form A is an old term used back when there used to be a Form B. It does not speak to what the access management form does. Access management form is just that. We use it to manage access to our asset. And so the name access management form reflects that. So in conversations when we're having it, to say Form A does not allude to the importance of the form. So if you are following standards and are up to date on the things that we were putting out, you'll notice that reviewers internally, externally talking to developers, Form A, not just the form itself, but the nomenclature itself is being updated, and the actual term for a Form A being mothballed at this point. Wanted to go over the new access management form that is posted online now. It is a 3-page form outlining the fact that this is a critical item during your design process, and to get this submitted to the city as soon as possible. So you have 3 sections: the critical item section, the background, and instructions. In the instructions, tells you how to submit the form, the background telling you why the form is important, and again, highly stressing the criticalness of this form. Second page captures trip generation information, normal information that you'll see, just tabulated a little bit differently. We also want a place on there to catch net new added trips. So it's a place where you can put existing trips generated, the proposed, capture the difference, and we can look at that and appropriately determine how this will affect the city's assets. And then the last page is really for internal use, is where we as reviewers of the city reviewing this access form will say, okay, we agree with these access points and give approval in this manner, or we'll say at this point a TAA is required, at which point we will also mark preliminarily what category that TAA would fall in, knowing that it's preliminary, and through discussions or review of the TAA that we may get into a discussion where Category 2 becomes a Category 3 or vice versa. But preliminary for our internal use to make sure that all stakeholders are aware of what level category this TIA is. So as you've seen, just some updates that were out of cycle that we wanted to touch on and update and try to get these processes and the way we're handling reviews more in line with what the city wants, and ultimately to help all stakeholders get their TAA access form and just access to the city street and city's assets quicker. So at this time, that's kind of a brief. Chapter 15 didn't have many items, but if there are any questions at this time, please post them on the chat. We'll take them now.
Brian, I'm not seeing any yet. We might just give it a minute. You might have just covered everything perfectly.
And I do want to stress getting that information to the city as soon as possible. One of the issues, at least with the permitting center, all commercial properties do require an access form. If you're coming for an access form and you're submitting your plans for final review, there will be discussions. If it's not following the IDM, there will be a lot of discussions, and it can be potentially hard discussions to have, and no one wants to have those conversations. We want those access management forms in early enough before final permitting. Let's talk about these access points, get these TAAs in early. Let's get this stuff nailed down, so when it does come to final permitting, all boxes are checked and we can move forward easily.
Okay, we did have a couple come in. So one, I think the answer is yes. Is the new form on the city website? Do we have it posted?
Yes, absolutely. So the access form is located on the city engineer's website under the section, the traffic section that's there. It's posted basically where the old one was posted. We've just replaced it.
All right, let me take a look there. They're coming in now. People realized. Let's see. All right. Is the city considering denying access to developments with access only on an existing road that does not meet current standards?
So that's a good question. So if you only have one access point that does not meet current standards, this falls into the category of we need to talk about this. You know, I think per ordinance, you have a right to one access point, but as far as safety, you know, kind of similar to the fire code, the emphasis is on safety. The direction for the 60-foot and the 100-foot distances that you see in IDM is all safety related and traffic movement related. So to that, I would say get your access management form in early. The city is We are not, there's always an option for variance, but we're not granting that many variances because ideally what's in the IDM matches exactly what the city wants. We do understand a very small percentage of things do not fall into that category, which this may be one of them. So again, spark that conversation early if you do fall into some sort of category the IDM doesn't address, and let's see if we can tackle it.
Okay, we're just about out of time. We have a couple more questions, but I think we can handle some of them. We'll be posting all of the questions and answers online. I think there's one that's coming up though from a couple different people. When does the new access management form take effect, and does it apply to plans that are already in for review?
So that's a good question. So the access form is up and ready to be used. So I think I referred to the release letter, and somebody had asked that question earlier in conjunction with, I think, Chapter 10. The release letter that's at the front of the IDM talks about at what point these requirements go into effect. So I would defer to that. You know, there's verbiage in there for initial review. So if it has been submitted for initial review after July 1, these requirements will be complied as far as the private sector information goes. So refer to that release letter, and the form is posted online.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. We have a couple more questions, but I will just refer to the website. We will get to all of them, and y'all can keep them coming in too, and we will we have a final question and answer at the very end where we can touch on some things, and we'll make sure they all get posted. So, Brian, I think we can pass it on to Jamie.